What's up, guys? My name is Mike, and welcome back to a very special episode of Let's Play Hearts of Iron 4, our Learn About Canada edition. So let's talk a little bit about Andrew McNaughton. So Andrew McNaughton was a huge figure in sort of like World War II propaganda. He was beloved as the next best thing. He was really considered to be like a Canadian god in the military, in the media, and so on. What's interesting is he's got this reputation simply for his personality and his ability to politic more than his actual skill. So I talked about how, and again, this is the third time I'm mentioning this now, the wars of today are fought with the tactics of yesterday. So Andrew McNaughton took this to heart, and he was one of the ones that was really pushing for keeping Canada separate. Like Arthur Carey did in the Great War, was insistent on having Canada fight as a separate entity, not just being mixed in with British and other allied troops. This was really sort of McNaughton's war cry through World War II, was maintaining that very separate Canadian identity, which got him a lot of points with, of course, Mackenzie King, who was just terrified of conscription and the embarrassment the Canadians were kind of facing at the time, being that the Americans that were entering the war with these Canadian soldiers are sitting in southern England from the start of the war, just basically going stale. They were going rotten on the shelf, having done basically nothing all war long. So enter Andrew McNaughton, who's fighting for all this stuff, fighting for having Canada independent and fighting on its own. So there's this little thing called Operation Sparta. And what Operation Sparta was, to this day, still the biggest military exercise of all time. Over 250,000 troops, tens of thousands of support people, and other support equipment and whatever else from all nations doing a massive military exercise in southern England. This was the preparation for Normandy, right? It was a combination of war games, practice, and so on. And I mean, one of the big things was with all these troops that were basically trapped in England, they might as well just continue to exercise them to the bone. Which was good and bad. I mean, the Brits didn't believe in battle fatigue to some degree, which really grated on a lot of the Canadian troops, who understood that, mentally and physically, you need a break sometimes. But Brits didn't believe in that. They believed in just hard work all the time. If you're tired, suck it up, just keep fighting. This was especially terrible with the airmen, who would frequently crash and run into air accidents because of this sort of philosophy. Anyway, so you had all these troops that are going stale. They run Operation Sparta. This is where the cracks in McNaughton's armor really started to show, because as it turns out, despite being this titan media figure in the military and essentially like Canada's savior, the face and saving face of Canada for international media everywhere, turns out he was kind of a shit commander. So they run this giant operation and everything goes wrong. First of all, he's completely inept at getting his supply lines and his logistics sorted out. I mean, they were 15 days behind on fuel for their trucks. They had way too many trucks lined up on the roads, and Canadians, being as polite as they weren't really interested in going off the roads to chew up civilian farms and infrastructure. So they were trying to stick to the roads, but the roads were completely jam-packed with trucks and tanks and APCs and the whole bit. And they realized that they had crammed the roads through their fronts with way too many people. And way too much equipment, way too much material. During the middle of the operations, his wireless communications, his radios went down for 15 hours, and he couldn't get anybody to fix it. He couldn't figure out how to get someone to fix his radios. So he was out without any commands for over 15 hours in the middle of a simulated battle. This is not a good thing to do. He also didn't really realize how, cumbersome some of these Army Corps could be, where he ordered an Army Corps, I think it was a second corps, to do some sort of maneuver overnight, not realizing that for such a large sort of army piece, it can take up to 24 hours for these commands to be taken out. So overall, just kind of a shit commander. And, it really showed. And there was a lot of hesitation and a lot of fear from the Brits and from the Americans about what was going on, because Canada came into the war with a bunch of bluster, had a lot of success, but had won a spot in the League of Nations, a big spot in the League of Nations during World War II, and were expected to be a huge ally in the Normandy invasion, which these guys were preparing for. Met with disaster at Dieppe, but had taken all those lessons, and they were basically just trying out all the knowledge they had learned at Dieppe in this Operation Sparta sort of like war games, right? But there was a lot of trepidation now about what Canada could actually accomplish, especially since Canada was still very, very low on officers. We were still running very low on officers because although most of our guys were being trained in 30 days, you can't train an officer in 30 days. We talked about that earlier, and it's a big gap in the problem. For a big problem in sort of the military structure is running low on officers for how many men were there. So the compromise was made, and this was kind of both a, get this guy off our back, because McNaughton was still talking a big game, and they weren't saying a lot of this stuff to his face, but I'm sure his troops, and he was probably starting to realize what was going on. So where this sort of came to a head, which was both the best and worst thing, I guess, really was, it was the best thing born out of the worst thing, but not McNaughton and his incompetence being the worst thing about World War II and its point in Canada's history also turned to be one of the best things, because what was happening is the Allies were now starting to plan the invasion of Italy, the soft underbelly of the Axis forces. You've probably heard that expression before, the soft underbelly. So with all due respect, Italian soldiers and the Italian military during this time was absolute shit. They were a complete logistical, organizational, equipment, and technology disaster in World War II. And they really, in my opinion, probably were the number one reason why the Axis lost. Thank God for the rest of us, but, considering they was on their side, one of the big problems was, of course, Hitler allied with Italy. And there's a famous quote where he talks about, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was something like, I could take 15 divisions to invade Italy, I could take 5 divisions to guard the border, or I could just, merge powers and fight with Italy alongside them. So Hitler was sort of a reluctant ally of Italy. He wasn't really the biggest fan, but ideologically they aligned, of course, being both the fascist sort of leaders of the world, along with Franz Ferdinand in Spain, who ultimately obviously ended up being neutral. But the ideologies aligned. They were both sort of, Mussolini, although not a great speaker as Hitler, was still very much about recapturing the old Roman glory of Italy. And same thing that Hitler was trying to recapture, the World War I borders of Germany. So they kind of aligned ideologically and politically, and it was sort of a natural match. But one of the big things that Italy screwed up was, because they were so incompetent at the time, they screwed up the invasion of Greece. So Napoleon is famous, I think this is Napoleon's quote, he's famous for saying the first rule, the first page, the first line of the book of How to Wage War is never, ever, ever invade Russia in winter. And of course, Hitler fell into that exact trap. He didn't exactly invade in Russia, but he invaded late in the year, completely unprepared for the Russian winter. He had assumed and anticipated to take Moscow before the winter hit, and of course that never happened. And a big part of that was because of Italy, because Italy was responsible for invading Greece, and they fucked it up. They got bogged down in Greece, and then Hitler had to come in and rescue Italy from the invasion of Greece, which delayed all of the fall of Berlin. Is just falling again? What? Where's Berlin? Berlin's over... Where? Warsaw. How's Berlin falling again? Berlin's here. It already fell, dumbasses. You fucks. You stupid shitheads. So Hitler had to redirect a lot of his resources to help bail out and complete the invasion of Greece, which of course slowed down and delayed the attack on the Soviet Union, which delayed everything and of course now led to the infamous sort of quagmire through the winter in the Soviet Union, which really prevented Hitler from capturing Moscow. Had that never happened, he may have been able to blitz through straight to Moscow and force the Soviet Union to capitulate before the winter, which means we would have been probably living in a very different world. Or at the very least, the war would have taken a much longer and much bloodier sort of turnabout without the help of the Soviets fighting throughout the war. Anyway, so rightfully so, Italy was seen as the soft underbelly of Europe, and all the Allies were intent on sticking a knife straight in it. So, like I said, this is what happened. So they were planning this invasion, and McNaughton was insistent that we need to have Canadian troops there. And the Brits and the Americans were secretly extremely hesitant, seeing the incompetence, but it wouldn't be McNaughton leading it, and they'd be kind of integrated in all the American commands, so they figured, okay, you know what, what's the harm? At the very least, what can happen is we can take these Canadian troops, we can battle hard them. Finally, these guys, having sat in Europe for 2 years, can get some battle experience, and then we can bring them back to England, and then they can be involved in the invasion of Normandy. So, overall, it would be win-win. We shut McNaughton up, we use these guys for something useful, and they could maybe help us out, and they get some experience, so they might be a little bit more useful going on. And in the meantime, they were going to do their best to kind of figure out the political disaster that would be MacNaughton if he was continued to give his way. As it turns out, the troops that were sent over to Italy did so well, they never actually made it back to England. They were integral in taking England, or pardon me, they were integral in taking Italy, and a huge part of the Allied victory in how fast it was. I mean, the whole invasion of Italy was like 30-something days from top to bottom, and they're absolutely integral with a ton of great stories coming out of that period, especially from the legendary 1st Division, the Old Red Patch. So I'm going to take a break, and then we're going to talk about these insane Canadian cowboys that really just charged headlong through mortar fire, through the Italian front lines, and made a huge impact in the Italian offensive that started the beginning of the end for the Axis. We'll talk about that next episode. Gonna take a break. Thanks so much, guys. Much love. Big kisses. We'll see you soon.